Good afternoon. Welcome to the session today. This is the sixth session of our Learning Exchange series. I'm Lauren Cooper. I'm the host today. I do share this with some of my team members sometimes now. And I direct the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University in the Forestry Department. But I'm also on the steering committee of the Forest Climate Working Group. And we do these series in partnership and really for the Forest Climate Working Group and the broader network of the group. And so we're pleased to lead the Learning Exchange series in partnership with this group and welcome you to check out some of our other events that we have as well. And if you're unfamiliar, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests with over 60 members, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active in carbon markets. The group has worked together for more than a decade now to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. And you can see this is our full lineup. We do have a couple more sessions in this year, and a note that if there's topics of interest that have passed, we do have all the recordings up and available. So still would encourage you to take a look at the full lineup here and definitely register for some of the upcoming events. But to get to today's speakers, I would like to introduce Dave MacFarlane, who's a professor of forest measurements and monitoring in my department here at Michigan State University in the Forestry Department, and Leslie Brandt, who's a climate change specialist with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, and the U.S. Forest Service. So together we'll be presenting on our session that we've titled today, The Role of Urban Forests in Climate Mitigation and Adaptation. So today's session is going to focus on how urban forests play an important role in helping communities adapt to climate change, but also how forests are vulnerable to changes in climate and how forests play an important role in potentially mitigating climate change and the potential to store carbon in those forests. So Dave will present data from both past and recent studies to discuss the potential for trees in urban areas to uptake carbon and provide shade as a mean of influencing climate. And Leslie will share how urban trees can be evaluated for their vulnerability and focusing on a recent assessment completed in the city of Detroit. And I'd like to take a minute to note that this is the first time we've done a deep dive on urban forestry in this series, and it's really exciting to bring this important topic area into our lineup. So really looking forward to the speakers today. But before we hand it over, a couple housekeeping details. We welcome you to submit questions at any time. So you'll see if you hover, we all know how to use Zoom pretty well now, but if your bar goes missing, hover around your screen and you can submit questions through the chat function or through the Q&A. We keep an eye on both. And so you're welcome to submit questions at any point. We won't stop for questions between the speakers, but we're planning for a nice Q&A and discussion at the end. But we don't want you to miss some clarifications that you think could be really, that you would like to have by waiting all the way to the end for questions. So feel free to submit questions, small clarifications to some bigger overarching questions, and we welcome your participation in that way. And another note that if you've registered for this event, you will receive an email with follow-up so that you'll know when the recording is up and available on the web. But if you are not yet on our mailing list, we do encourage you to sign up. You can get news and information about upcoming webinars, upcoming sessions. We have a quarterly newsletter as well. So if you're not and you're interested, please email us at forestc@msu.edu to join our email list, or our mailing list. And then I should mention, if you are on the phone or you have trouble for some reason on the chat, you're welcome to email us questions at forestc@msu.edu, and we are monitoring that during the session as well, so you can submit questions in that way. And a final note here, in case of outstanding questions, which we likely will have, because we're getting such great participation in our sessions now, we will work with speakers to follow up and get some clarifications on some of those questions. And so we'll put them together in a Word document and post as a PDF along with the supplemental materials for the event. So we post the recording and slide decks and also any outstanding Q&As. So if we are unable to get to your question, rest assured we will connect with the speakers on that. And then moving a final detail on continuing education credits. For those attendees that are affiliated with SAF or Society of American Foresters, The session is approved for SAF credits, and so this will be automatically updated to your SAF account if you receive credit with SAF, and if you've registered with the appropriate email address that is associated with SAF. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out to us at Forestry, but we do submit the full list of emails, so it should match up there. And then we also have CEUs from ISA. And so if you would like to receive ISA credits, though, you do need to reach out to us and we will share the event code with you. So just want to let you know that those are available if those are important to you. And so that's a little bit on the background, and we're excited to hand it over to our speakers. So with that, Dave, will you please share your screen and begin today's presentation?
Okay, let's see if I can make this work the way I want to. Okay, very good. So hello, everybody out there in Zoom land. This first part is going to be about carbon capture measurements and shading. And as Lauren mentioned, this may be the first time that you're thinking about carbon and climate change in an urban context. So as the first speaker, I thought I'd start with this slide and just sort of remind everyone that basically cities are, they're centers of human metabolism. We bring all kinds of materials in, concrete and steel, which heat up the environment. We consume a lot of resources, and we emit a lot of greenhouse gases. And so the process of urbanization, land changing over to urban condition, is a process of heating the land both locally and globally, and increasing emissions. So in the context of this work and a lot of my research in this area, trying to answer the question, how can city trees help with mitigation and adaptation to this condition? So this is an infographic from the FAO of the United Nations listing all these different benefits of urban trees. For purposes of mitigation and adaptation, I'm just going to focus on a couple here. The first relates to shading, and this infographic says basically strategic placement of trees in urban areas can cool the environment somewhere between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius. That's significant. I highlighted the word strategic placement here because in order to really set these strategies, we need to understand how trees of different sizes and species can grow and thrive and function in different parts of urban areas in order to effectively create this shading benefit. Now, a major area of research for me has been trying to figure out how much carbon is actually captured in a tree. This infographic says that a tree can absorb up to 150 kilograms of CO2 in a year. As a measurement scientist, I'm interested in variation in that number. How does that vary from tree to tree, from site to site, from species to species? And I'm going to focus there for the rest of the talk. So I thought I'd start with this question: how much carbon is actually in a tree? So we're talking about tons, and we're talking about a gas. So most people don't sort of think about how much a gas weighs. This is a nice picture I found where a group of school children and some teachers wanted to visualize what the volume of a ton of CO2 is. And so they created this giant cube, which would hold about a ton of CO2, given the molecular weight of CO2. We think of trees, trees are taking in this CO2 from the atmosphere and embedding it into their body. And so if we take a live trunk of a tree, we can call that 1 pound of green biomass, and about half of that's water. So if we boil that away, we get about a half a pound of dry matter. And then if we do an analysis of the elemental content, we'll see that about half of that is carbon. So a good rule of thumb is about a 1/4 pound of live tree mass is carbon. So the question becomes, how much does a tree weigh? So the way I've been pursuing this in research for about the past decade is to go around and cut trees down and weigh all the different parts of them. And you could see we cut the tree up into different pieces like the branches and the stems. And actually we do about 8,000 measurements per tree. So these trees are giving their life for science, but we're collecting a lot of data on them. And one of the important things I want to call your attention to is in the experimental design, we're looking at trees of different species, having different wood density and different tolerances to shade, all sorts of different aspects, so that we're covering a broad range of variation in different types of trees. And then what we do with this data is we build mathematical models that help us to predict the amount of carbon that's in a tree given all of these variables. And so the most common and simple way we can measure a tree is what's called diameter at breast height. So we can wrap a tape measure around a tree and basically measure its circumference or its girth. And it turns out that that is fairly highly statistically correlated with the amount of mass that's in it. So we need this kind of data to generate these models. Now, a lot of the context for my work has been working with the US Forest Service on the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. This is our nation's tree census, right? So it's a fantastic program. Congress puts a lot of money into it and basically sets up a series of monitoring plots all across the United States. And foresters go in and they measure trees on these plots to track change in the nation's forests over time. So what my colleagues and I at other universities in partnership with FIA have been doing is building new sets of models for them to take those tree measurements on those plots all across the country and convert them into estimates of how much carbon is captured in the trees. Now, a few years ago, FIA decided to expand their national forest inventory from rural forests, what we would typically think of forests, into urban areas. So they're now collecting the same kind of a data in cities. This is finally giving us the opportunity to start actually measuring the carbon capture in trees in urban areas. And it's part of their long-term strategic direction to implement this annualized inventory of trees in urban settings. So many years ago, what is this, 2009, I did a preliminary study of Michigan cities to try to see, how much biomass and energy and carbon could be sequestered in the trees of US cities and the implications for sustainable forest management. Well, since then, there's been a lot more focus on this. And one of the questions that's been raised by scientists, including the ones in this paper, is can you take the same types of models and equations that we use in the rural forests and apply them to urban trees? So are urban trees different somehow? So with this data I have, and the blue dots represent trees, individual trees measured destructively in rural forest areas, and the pink dots are in urban areas. And one of the things you'll notice right away is that urban trees at the same girth are way shorter. So they're stockier. Now, if we look at the crown diameter, which is W in this picture, how wide does the crown grow? And we compare that to the height. That black line represents what's called a one-to-one line. So that means that a tree on that line is about as tall as it is wide, right? So urban trees are basically about as tall as they are wide. Forest-grown trees are much narrower relative to their height because they're being crowded in by other trees, generally in the forest. Okay, what does that translate into mass? Well, it basically means, and by the way, this is on a logarithmic scale because there's an exponential increase in the mass of a tree with diameter at breast height. We can basically see that trees in rural areas allocate more energy to, and more carbon essentially is stored in their stems, and that urban trees store more in branches. So what's the implication of that? Well, there's one of the major techniques we use for taking forest inventory data and turning it into carbon capture data is to use something called a biomass expansion factor. And basically, most forest inventories collect data on the stem volume, the main stem, because that's where the merchantable wood is. And so we can take simple measurements like the height, H, and the diameter at breast height, and get a pretty good estimate from a model about what is the volume of wood in that stem. And then if we have some estimate of what the density of that wood is, now remember density is mass per unit volume, so if we multiply that by volume, we get the mass. We can get the mass of the stem. And then the expansion factor is that we can take that and we can expand it up to the mass of the whole tree. And so some colleagues of mine at different universities and within the Forest Service, again, doing a lot of research and publishing it. And this paper from 2018 basically showed that this component ratio method that's used in rural forests that kind of works like this works pretty well. So could we apply that same to urban trees? Well, it turns out not quite, right? So this is the stem mass versus the above ground mass. So if you actually want to expand the stem mass to the above ground mass, we see we have a different relationship for urban trees than we do for rural trees. In fact, at the same diameter, at the same stem mass, excuse me, we have more mass in an urban tree than we do in a rural tree. That's at the same stem mass. So why might that be? Well, one of the clues is in this wood density. So where do we get that wood density from? So Miles and Smith published this, who worked for the US Forest Service's researchers, collected all this information and came up with species-specific values of wood density. So we know about how dense the material of the tree is. And so what you see on the x-axis here is the published stem wood densities for different species. And what you see on the y-axis is what we measured when we cut the trees down. And you can see for the forest-grown trees, they actually match pretty well what's in those publications. But the urban trees are actually denser, right? So a sugar maple is denser growing in this urban environment than it is growing in the forest. And that's would affect our estimates. And in fact, some other researchers, I found this publication, wanted to estimate carbon capture in trees in agricultural areas. So these would be hedgerows or trees growing out in a cornfield, and basically found something similar. So part of the riddle here is what is different is basically that these trees are growing in the open. Now, some colleagues and I are working on wind. How does wind affect trees? And so there are hypotheses out there that basically say that high density wood helps you to resist the wind more. And also having a squatter growth form also helps you to resist the wind. So I teamed up with another scientist, Brian Kane at University of Massachusetts. He's in urban forestry. And we tested this sort of hypothesis that, as urban trees have less tree neighbors around them, they're more exposed to the wind. And maybe that's why that could partially explain why that they're denser and squatter. Okay, so we published this paper about neighbor effects, who are the trees in your neighborhood, right? And so the functional trade-offs balancing crown competitiveness and wind resistance was the focus of this. But basically the idea was, what is different about these trees that are growing with fewer tree neighbors around them? Here's one of the graphs from that paper. It basically shows that this branch mass to stem mass ratio is an important indicator. So when a tree grows out in the open, it spreads out and builds a bigger crown and branches. And when it's crowded by other trees, it tends to allocate a lot more energy into its stem. So we asked the question, does urban really equal open grown in this context? And so the US Forest Service on all of these National Forest Inventory plots assigns every tree a crown class code. And so an open grown tree, like you see in the picture, is kind of growing out with no other trees around it. Then we have a canopy dominant tree, which is kind of one of the big trees that it's up on the top, bigger than the trees around it and shading it. And then we have these overtop trees, which are down in the shade and they're being crowded and shaded by trees above them. And so I replotted the data for both rural and urban trees, and I plotted them by their canopy class code. And what you can see here, the blue line, is that the open grown trees in rural areas are actually pretty similar to the open grown trees in urban areas. So the big difference here appears to be how many neighbors does a tree have around it, affecting its density and things like its carbon capture. Right, here's a picture of a very big ash tree from some survey work we did. This tree grew out in a field A long time ago, the field was abandoned and let to grow into a forest. So this is an open grown rural tree. You can see next to it an open grown urban tree growing in somebody's front lawn. So part of the story here is what is the neighborhood of trees around the tree? And this helps us to understand what does an urban forest actually mean, right? So in this little picture here of a park, we kind of imagine an urban tree as this tree growing up with very few or no trees around it. But we could also have a setting where there is a forest embedded in an urban area. And in that situation, we would expect the urban trees to behave more like forest trees. Okay, so how does it actually help us with this process? So I told you biomass expansion factors are a major way that we take forest inventory data and convert it into forest carbon capture data. So we could create smarter biomass expansion factors. In this case, we would measure the trunk mass and then expand that up to the above ground biomass. And you could see we could use the canopy class code for the different trees on both the urban and the rural plots. And we could get a generalized modeling system that would work both in urban and rural areas. So in a lot of my data I've showed so far comes from chopping trees down and weighing them. But more recently, we've been working with laser scanners. That's a faro-focused laser scanner. And so now what I've been doing with my students and fellow researchers is instead of having to cut the trees down, what we're doing is we put this laser scanner around the trees and it shoots out pulses of laser light. They bounce off the tree and they come back and create these really detailed 3D models of the tree. So in the upper right there, you can see that's a honey locust that was scanned on the Michigan State University campus. We have a complete three-dimensional model of it. And then also I zoomed in here and you could see how much detail. We can even see the structure of the bark. This also has a color camera on it. And so every laser point is also registered with a color photograph. Anyway, this gives us really interesting data. So that's Giorgio Sarcinio. He's a PhD student working in my lab with me, and he's been doing a lot of work trying to see how urban trees are different as part of his doctoral dissertation. And so what we're trying to do for the Forest Service and in general is trying to figure out, can we create these models to estimate mass and carbon in trees without having to cut any trees down at all? And so what you'll see in this preliminary graphic that Giorgio's created, we have the total tree mass on the y-axis and we have the diameter at breast height on the x-axis. Now, the red color indicates destructive sample data and the green indicates laser scan data. And the circle symbols indicate rural forests and the triangles indicate urban forests. And so what this shows you in general is that we can create models that are very similar just by scanning the trees to what we could get from cutting them down. And we could also create models that are equivalent in both urban and rural settings. So this is good news for creating new ways to capture the much needed data for urban areas without having to cut trees down. Right, and so some Matt Disney at the University College London and a bunch of other international researchers put out this paper a few years ago basically saying you can weigh trees with lasers, and apparently we can weigh trees with lasers. So just real briefly on the shading side, one of these things these lasers give us is these very detailed captures of the structure of trees. And I've always been fascinated by what's called the fractal branching pattern of trees. And this comes from a branch of mathematics that looks at self-similarity, but trees are said to be fractal-like. You can see these nice artistic images of fractal trees in the upper right. But actually, Georgios and I have applied that, and we just published this paper basically showing that urban tree drought tolerance is related to the fractal dimension of the crowns and the leaves. And also the fractal dimension of the tree crowns actually responds to the heat environment in different US cities. So what does that mean is that this measurable fractal dimension coming from lasers that we can get from scanning trees can actually tell us something about how they can survive heat and drought in cities, which has very big implications for climate change mitigation. Also, I would point out that trees have different types of leaves, which on the one hand affect their ability to cast shade, but also this leaves have like a fractal architecture in and of themselves. And so one of our other findings was that the leaf mass per unit area, which is an expression of the structure and weight of the leaf, responds also to this fractal dimension. And so basically, this implies that there's a trade-off between casting shade and resisting heat and drought. Again, this has important management implications. And it's probably why the National Arbor Day Foundation is advertising trees that can both that are both drought tolerant and can throw shade, because it's kind of an unusual combination. So I'll just end by saying that we're continuing to study the fractal geometry of trees, but we're really interested in this idea of how this adapts trees to city life in this article we just came out with. But I would call on everybody who's talking about all the benefits that we get from trees to also ask, what is it that we can do for trees to make it so they can better adapt to city life? And I'll stop there, and I think Lauren will come back on.
Yes, thank you so much. This was a really great background, and we already do have some nice questions rolling in, but I think that this really quantitative background is going to provide a great transition, and your closing thoughts there, a great transition over to Leslie. So if she's ready to take the screen, we'll hear from Leslie now to look at kind of some of the applied applications of the topic today. Take it away, Leslie. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm Leslie Brandt with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the U.S. Forest Service. And I'm going to be talking about some work today that I've done in collaboration with partners at American Forests that was funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. So just for a background for those of you who are not familiar with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, we are a chartered organization by the USDA Forest Service, and we work collaboratively with a number of university partners and other partners, including American Forests, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, on providing practical information, resources, and technical assistance related to forests and climate change. And we do work both on the carbon mitigation side as well as the climate adaptation side. And today I'll be focusing more on adaptation, although some of the work that this touches on also applies to carbon. Today I'm going to be talking about a new tool that is available on the Vibrant Cities Lab website called the Climate and Health Action Guide. And the action guide is designed for urban and community foresters, public health professionals, as well as climate and sustainability professionals, planners, and landscape architects to walk through a process to develop robust actions that incorporate considerations of climate change adaptation, carbon management, and human health in urban forest management. The action guide is built off the adaptation workbook that we have developed at NIACS. So if you've worked with us in other areas, this might look familiar to you. We start with defining project goals and objectives, assess climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, evaluate goals and objectives given those climate change impacts, use information to identify and implement adaptation actions, and then walk people through a process to think about how we would monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of our actions. And the whole idea is to practice that adaptive management loop. So for the Climate and Health Action Guide, we're really looking at the intersection of human health, climate change adaptation, and carbon mitigation as it applies to urban forest benefits. So when we start with the guide, we really want to orient people to thinking holistically about these three aspects. The guide then asks people to think about what are the goals that they have for their particular urban forests. And then under that, what are the specific objectives that they're trying to achieve in the short and long term that relate to those specific goals. We then ask folks to think about how climate change might affect their urban forests and how that relates to human health and carbon management. One of the tools that has been really useful for understanding how climate change might affect urban trees is to look at current and projected changes in hardiness zones and heat zones. We at NIAX, in a collaboration with the Office of Sustainability and Climate in the Forest Service, have developed a story map tool that allows you to look at both the current and projected changes in hardiness zones and heat zones across the United States. And you can zoom in on your particular location of interest and use a slider tool to see how it might change in a particular area. So right here, what you're seeing on the left is the current plant hardiness zones, which are determined by the lowest temperatures over a 30-year period. And on the right are future projected for the last 30 years of this century under a high emission scenario. And as you can see across Michigan, and I just tried to pick right the line where MSU is, that we're switching from a zone 6 to possibly a zone 8 by the end of the century. And then we were able to do the same thing for heat zones. So those are determined by the number of days over 30 degrees Celsius. And those are even more dramatic than what we're seeing for hardiness zones. So right now in Michigan, we are heat zone about, I think it's about a 4 or 5. The numbers on the bottom are the number of days, but not the zone numbers. And then we're switching to zone 8 or 9 by the end of the century. And so that can dramatically affect what species are able to be planted in particular areas. Now, in addition to understanding the direct effects of temperature, there's also other important things that we have to consider with our urban trees. One key thing when we're thinking about vulnerability is adaptive capacity, or the ability of a system to accommodate or cope with potential climate change impacts with minimal disruption. In order to look at adaptive capacity, we've developed a scoring system that's based on literature review and expert review by horticulture and arboriculture specialists. And that enables us to get a qualitative score for individual trees. And we have done this for hundreds of species across the United States now. So an example of a species that has relatively high adaptive capacity, that means it's able to withstand a lot of different stressors, is Kentucky coffee tree. It doesn't have a lot of major pests or disease issues. It's adaptable to a wide variety of soils and climates, urban tolerant, relatively low maintenance, widely available, and relatively drought tolerant as well. So we have used the information about projected changes in hardiness and heat zones along with these adaptive capacity scores to develop site level species lists for different urban areas across the country. And these are available right now on our forestadaptation.org website. And if you go to the urban focus page, you will find them. And you can click on any of these individual dots and you will get to a page that provides a species list that is tailored to your particular community. So this is an example of what we have for Detroit. This includes the current and projected heat and hardiness zones for both a low and a high emission scenario, as well as different 30-year periods. And then this list of species that's specifically designed for that area. So it looks at tree species that are commonly planted or could be planted in the Detroit region, and then evaluates it for vulnerability under a low and high emission scenario. So both if we took dramatic actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or if we continued on a business as usual scenario. Then for a few select cities, we've gone even deeper and developed more comprehensive vulnerability assessments. We are right in the process now of publishing a report for the city of Detroit that includes an evaluation of the vulnerability of trees in the inventory by district so that we can see if there's any sort of spatial variation in where the most vulnerable trees are and how the number of trees that are planted in a particular city of different species might influence how many species and trees are vulnerable in that area. In addition to looking at the effects on trees, it's really important to also think about the human health implications of climate change. So in our most recent assessment for Detroit, we also include a chapter on human health impacts as they relate to urban trees. And we include a list of allergenicity of different tree species and a discussion of how climate change might affect allergen production for urban trees. And so that's another piece that we want people to start considering, not just the effects on the trees themselves or just the effects on the human community, but also that interaction. So getting back to the action guide, once you've assessed your vulnerability, it's time to think about how climate change and all of these other factors might affect challenges and opportunities for meeting your goals and objectives. So challenges associated with urban forests and climate change might be more pests and invasive species or increased maintenance and tree care required. But there could be opportunities, including increased interest by the community to take more actions or new policies or funding sources that work to try to protect the urban forest. Another key aspect of our action guide is still in development, but it will be rolled out next month. This is our adaptation strategies and approaches guide for climate and health. And what this does is helps you step down really broad adaptation concepts to more specific on-the-ground tactics that can be taken to address your biggest challenges and opportunities. This menu was developed based on specific considerations around urban forestry and human health and is organized in a tiered hierarchy that works towards more transition to future climates as you go farther down the list. This is a very thorough and comprehensive review. We developed this in collaboration with Dr. Kathy Wolf at the University of Washington, who's an expert in urban forests and human health. And then we had this list independently reviewed by experts across the country at the intersection of urban forestry and climate change. I'll just briefly walk you through this menu. The first thing that we want folks to think about is how that intersection of social systems, human health actions, and urban forests interact. And so that kind of lays the foundation for the other strategies moving forward. The second strategy focuses most on reducing the impacts of human health threats from a changing climate using urban trees and forests to help mitigate those effects. The third strategy is a more mitigation-focused strategy that's focused on maintaining or increasing the extent of urban forest and vegetation cover, while also considering the social, human health, and adaptation concepts of doing that. The 4th through 6th strategies are really focused on adapting our urban forests to a changing climate. So sustaining and restoring fundamental ecological functions, reducing impacts of stressors on our urban forests, and then enhancing the diversity of our urban tree canopy. The last strategy that really focuses on the on the impacts of climate change on urban trees is to alter urban ecosystems towards new and expected conditions. This is where you might take actions to change your species composition or change the types of ecosystems that you're managing for in your urban environment. The last two strategies really focus on social cohesion and human well-being in response to a changing climate. So how can we use urban trees to help us promote mental and physical and social health? Once you've gone through and thought about your adaptation strategies, the next step is to evaluate them for their costs and benefits. And so that's the next step in the action guide. And so that will allow you to start to think about which actions could you take that are going to be most effective and feasible and something that you're going to likely be able to employ in your particular location. And then the final step in the action guide focuses on creating a monitoring plan where we're constantly using observation and analysis to refine and reflect upon our actions and develop more robust objectives and actions. We have a number of examples on our forestadaptation.org website that have focused on understanding the adaptation strategies that people in urban environments can take. Now, these were developed primarily before this action guide was developed, and so they focus more on the urban forest itself, but some of them are starting to integrate these other social and human health aspects as well. So I'm going to walk through one example that we recently did in Providence, Rhode Island, and this is the first project where we explicitly use the Climate and Health Action Guide, as well as the Tree Equity Score that was developed by our partners in American Forests to develop climate change adaptation strategies that are at that intersection of human health, carbon management, and climate adaptation. So the overall goals of this project that is focused on the lower South Providence area in the city of Providence was to increase and enhance canopy cover, decrease stormwater runoff, engage residents, community groups, and institutions, and protect the existing tree canopy. This is an area that, based on these tree equity scores, was considered to have lower tree equity than some surrounding areas. And so the Providence Neighborhood Planting Program, along with the City of Providence, was really interested in how they could enhance their canopy in this particular location. Some of the climate change impacts they focused on were warmer temperatures. So this is in an area that is in the urban heat island. They were also concerned about extreme events, localized flooding because of a combined stormwater system. And the trees that they did have tended to be older and were more susceptible to breakage from wind. They were also concerned about altered soil moisture and increased drought risk during summer months when air temperatures were higher and precipitation was projected to decrease. Some challenges and opportunities to meeting their goals were that it would be more difficult to establish their trees in hot or potentially dry environments. There could be potentially fewer volunteer days in the summer because of heat. And there's a less hospitable environment should say hospitable, not hospital, for maintenance activities. On the opportunity side, though, they saw an opportunity to plant a wider variety of species from more southern climatic zones. There could be a longer planting season for undertaking these activities, and that just the issue of climate change raises the importance of that action. The specific adaptation tactics that they developed based on the adaptation strategies menu was to select drought adapted and wind tolerant trees by examining the adaptive capacity scores for those individual tree species. They wanted to develop communication strategies using local schools and organizations, and that really focuses a lot more on the social aspect of their work. And then one thing that we discussed was to create small green spaces that could incorporate nature and then are designed for community healing as a place where people could interact with their environment on a local level. Some of the things that they're interested in monitoring are the number and diversity of new trees planted, also looking at their trees that are pruned and maintained by volunteers. Another big thing they're looking at is increasing volunteer participation in a volunteer stewardship program. And then they're also doing risk assessments for those older trees and treating ash trees to prevent infection or infestation from emerald ash borer in particular areas. So if you're interested in learning more, you can check out the action guide at the Vibrant Cities Lab website. And then a lot of our other tools I mentioned today are on our forestadaptation.org website under the urban forest focus area. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lauren.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think what I can do is put us on like a little panel-y kind of setting, which makes the most sense, I think. So Leslie, that was awesome. It's really exciting to see all of the applied work and really thinking through the interventions on the ground and how that interfaces with communities that live in those places. We do have a number of questions, and they really reflect kind of the range of interdisciplinary topics that we've touched on today, and that are also really crucial to the whole urban forestry conversation. So I'll jump in with maybe a kind of a follow-up question for you, Dave. We had a couple questions more about on the measurement side of things. So the first one was, and you might be able to speak to this as well, Leslie, so feel free to jump in too, but looking at the influence of site quality on trees and the challenge. So Leslie, you might be able to speak to more of the challenges of that in urban settings, but this specifically was on the measurement side as well for you, Dave. So how does the influence of site quality, like precipitation or soil or impervious surfaces, influencing carbon storage in trees essentially? And what's your general sense on that? Is it slower growth, or just what are your general trends that you could speak to on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, but let me put it in a few terms. First of all, we sort of have established methodologies for measuring site quality in rural areas. In urban areas, not so much. Urban soils are very heterogeneous, and the environments that trees in are heavily impacted by things like buildings, structures, sidewalks, everything like that. So it's actually somewhat difficult to generalize about urban tree site and soils. And there's not a lot of systematic ways in place like there are in rural forests to, say, scale a site for a high or low quality site for growth or things like that. That being said, I'm actually a licensed tree doctor amongst various credentials. And so one of the things that happens is in trees sort of show in their stress something about the site. So we can tell if the soil's compacted, or we can tell if the soil's poorly drained or things like that in some of the damage or disease that we see in the top of the tree. Right now, in terms of future research, some of the work I'm doing now is I'm actually scanning trees in different environments. So we have an experimental design where we're scanning trees that are paved on 2 sides or 1 sides or 3 sides or 4 sides, or trees that are right next to a building. So we're looking at the distance from a building. And so we're actually scanning trees in all kinds of different environments, the same species, to see if we could start to categorize the types of structural effects we see showing up on the trees in different environments. But the science is nowhere near the way it is where we could use language like site quality like we do in rural forests. And so just a huge amount of additional research that would need to be done to really characterize like what it's like for that particular urban tree, or all streets are not the same, all parks are not the same, et cetera.
That's really helpful, and it does speak to the challenges of complex urban landscapes. Leslie, do you think you could speak to that same question as well, maybe more from the from the challenges of the site quality, but also another question I had for you was linking to the decision maker side of things. So complex landscapes, both in conditions and soil quality and all of this, but also who can make decisions over those parcels. And so if you could speak to just maybe some of those challenges in those, again, those complex urban landscapes where you have many factors in small areas compared to large rural landscapes.
Yeah, again, a lot to unpack there. So in most, municipalities, the majority of trees are on private land where the decision maker is the individual homeowner. And so we have kind of limited influence often on how what trees are selected for planting in those areas, and how those trees are stewarded. Where there's more influence is in these public spaces, both in parks and along streets, and so I think that there's a lot of work happening there to develop some very sophisticated tools to make decisions about how to select just the right tree for that particular location. But I think that there's still work that needs to be done to kind of translate that work to the general public in a way that is something that they can pick up and work with, or working with a certified arborist professional to help decide what is really the best tree for that particular location. I'm not quite sure if I've answered your question or not, but
yeah, I might, well, you have, but I might come back around on this in a minute too, because it's a big challenge. We did get a question for you, Dave, back on measurement side is, are you, or how, can you just frame thinking about carbon storage in root systems for trees and how that's handled in an urban setting?
So yeah, so even in well-studied scientific forests, we still don't really have a good grasp on what's happening in the root system. What we mainly use is something called root to shoot ratios, which is basically the idea that if there's this much mass in the top of the tree, there's about this much mass in the bottom, right? And so, like, for example, all across the world, if you're in a savanna or if you're in a rainforest, we know roughly what those ratios might be because of the relative amount of above ground versus below ground tree biomass. Now, urban areas, again, add another layer on top of that because they often have a lot of restrictions to the root systems. So my guess would be that if a tree is the more impacted a tree is, planted in a hole in the sidewalk as opposed to growing in a park, the more those root to shoot ratios are going to be altered. So they both depend on the species, they depend on the climate, and then within that, they depend on what's the physical rooting medium that the trees are in. So I would say that, again, the urban environment has this added layer of complexity that we can say, yeah, a tree in the Midwest has a root to shoot ratio of roughly this, but is there is it growing in compacted gravel with a sidewalk on all sides and a subway below it? I'm thinking of New York City or something like that. What's the environment for that tree? So more than likely, more stressed root systems, lower carbon storage, and affecting maybe the above ground part of the tree as well for that reason.
Thanks, Dave. It's helpful. We do have a couple questions here about, I know these are all kind of like intersecting questions. This is one getting into maybe some of the nuances of species types. And like, so we have one question that's about some of the maintenance factors for, example, like fruiting trees or leaf drop. And, in some communities that there can be like pushback to having certain types of trees because of these reasons. And that can be a challenge. And then also another question, which is possibly related, is the use of exotic species. What's your outlook on that, and when is that appropriate or a concern? I'll maybe have you respond first, Leslie. I'm not sure, Dave, if you'll have thoughts on this, but it's kind of more on the social side of things. So just how are you addressing that, and what's your current outlook?
Yeah, so on the maintenance issue, that is definitely something that is something we're aware of. That is something we incorporated into our adaptive capacity scores. So species that required less maintenance received, a more positive sub-score in this maintenance category. And so we can pull out that information if people are, interested in like low maintenance trees, or the climate information can be kind of overlaid on lists of, tree species that people are also considering for other reasons. The use of exotic species, if they're not invasive, and sometimes there's, not a guarantee that they won't become invasive, but often it has to be part of the strategy when thinking about very highly altered urban environments where your soil conditions and the urban heat island and other things are so different from the surrounding native landscape that there might be a real limited number of species that you can plant in a particular area. And so my general thinking is that when we're talking about more natural areas within an urban landscape, those are places where we can focus on native species. And when we're talking about, street trees in downtowns or any other areas where, they're very, inhospitable conditions, if we want to increase our biodiversity to a point where we're reducing risk, we might need to incorporate some non-invasive, non-native species.
A super interesting answer.
I would just add one thing to that. So making the distinction between non-native is all about it's more about political boundaries and geography. These people in Rhode Island that Leslie mentioned want to plant, would love to grow a nice southern magnolia or a live oak, it sounds like, in downtown Providence, right? So if you were to just draw a political boundary between southern and northern United States, you might say that that those species are non-native there, right? So that if it's a geographic definition and climate is changing geography, then really what is native where? I mean, so it's this idea that nativity, is affected both by political geography and natural geography. It kind of blurs what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, when we're thinking about what species would be considered native, we tend to think about things that are native to the general region. And also, my colleagues with the Forest Service, Lewis Iverson and others, have looked at sort of the colonization potential, like how far could that species disperse and naturally get there if there weren't barriers to their dispersal. And so you could think about incorporating, if you're really concerned about native species, incorporating those species that might be able to colonize a new area on their own over time anyway, and incorporate that into your kind of assisted migration plan. But again, yes, there are a lot of species that might be, native to one state but not another, but it's a political boundary and not a natural boundary.
That's a really interesting response to that. So thank you so much for that. And I know we are on the hour and we usually don't go over, but I'd like to ask one more question. So apologies and feel free to hop off for folks that have their conflicts. But I wanted to end just kind of on a bigger picture. There's a lot of increasing attention, as we know, on forests as a climate solution generally. A lot of interest from governments, major corporations, lots of investments. And I guess, Leslie, you probably have a certain perspective on this, but how do we ensure that, first of all, urban forests don't get left out of that conversation? And then also, like, what is the ideal outlook for them? So if we were to, if we're getting the emphasis on forests, where's an ideal scenario that we could be heading in 20 or 30 years in terms of like canopy and just what is your general sense for both of you? But maybe I'll start with you, Leslie, just from the kind of attracting maybe the political attention to the role there first.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing urban forests being considered more and more as a solution both for mitigation and adaptation in our cities. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There's also opportunities for things like city forest credits where you can get funding for forestation projects in cities and get carbon credits for them. So I think that there are opportunities there as well. And so I think that urban forests are, while they take up a small amount of area on the landscape, they're the place that people see and interact with nature. And so if you want to get people excited about trees, that's where you need to start.
Thanks, Leslie. And so maybe Dave, I don't know if you have some additional thoughts, but certainly from a mitigation potential, or if you could speak to just kind of like a high level, where could we be going in an ideal scenario in terms of mitigation potential of our urban forests, and where might there be some barriers?
I would say, so first of all, I agree with what Leslie said, and I feel like to me, just personally, like more trees is better, because I feel like, we need to preserve green spaces. That's just part of our living habitat. I especially feel like, just part of the human health and all of those other aspects, which I don't specifically study, are very important consideration as part of this. But I will say that what my research has shown so far is, and what I believe to be the case, is that the shading and cooling aspect and the environmental mitigation aspect is probably more important than the carbon capture part of it, because the urban areas have fairly low tree densities compared to the surrounding areas, and there are only so many places you can plant them based on social constraints. The capacity to get like lots and lots of carbon sucked up into cities is limited compared to the capacity to actually reduce the urban heat island effect and to just mitigate the climate of cities. So I think, as much as I've been an advocate for planting trees for carbon capture in urban areas, I feel like the environmental mitigation provided by the trees themselves is bigger than the potential carbon benefit. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that and just think that cities are just going to suck up all of this carbon.
I think that's a great point. And on that, that's just a theme that comes up repeatedly is, obviously climate's an umbrella concern that's, intersecting in all sorts of ways, but the carbon piece itself is, just one layer of values for trees and forests, and that we have all sorts of values.
And I'll put in one more plug. So Michigan State University just built a mass timber building, a brand new building that's beautiful building built out of wood, which used to have to be built out of concrete and steel. And both on the consumption of fossil fuels, and the building materials themselves, that's another way we can go. We can think about more natural materials, wood, as a building material for cities in the future, which both sequesters carbon and actually reduces heating. And so I think, that, and someone just texted in there, urban wood utilization definitely is another part. So just thinking about like the materials we bring into cities and how we build cities is really an important part of this whole carbon and climate mitigation.
Yeah, those are great points and really big topics. And like that was actually Leslie that popped that in there. And there's a big, concerns are, wood waste material, dealing with after storms and leveraging these resources. And so that's a lot of really interesting work on, smaller bioeconomies around our urban areas. So thanks for bringing in those ideas. Okay, well, so to wrap up, because we are getting a bit over, just want to say a really hearty thank you to both of you for the time that you put in prepping your talks and sharing your knowledge with us today and having this brief discussion. A reminder for everyone that the session is being recorded. We'll make all the materials available on our website shortly. And very, very thankful for folks that spent the time with us today and submitted their questions. We'll be following up with our speakers on a couple of outstanding points, but I think we got to a lot of it. And so that's it. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks so much for the time. Leslie, Dave, really appreciate it. Good to see you.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.